Great. All right. Hey, everybody. Well, thanks for coming. This is good. Welcome to the quarantine book launch. I'll be drinking some white seltzer water throughout. Not a sponsor, could be. Theoretically, this is also going to YouTube. Matt Teaches Online, so you could see it there later. You could see it there whenever you want. You could write nasty comments on there, and we'll go. So it's 1 o'clock, so we'll start. Since we all have busy lives and time is meaningless now. So this is the book launch for Satire in the State, Sketch Comedy in the Presidency. So very excited that this came out. And of course, one of my big worries when I was writing the book was that by the time it came out, it would be completely out of date. So yeah, that came true. What are you going to do? So here we go. Trent Gray is watching. A hero is here, so that's good. So how's this going to work? So I'm going to do like a little quick brief overview of just sort of big picture of the book, talk a couple minutes about JFK, read a little section about JFK because he is the president you all voted for in the online poll that you wanted to hear more about. So we'll talk a little bit about JFK. We'll do the Vicky Fotis Please Read My Son's Book giveaway after that, and then we'll have a little time for some Q&A, and it'll be a good time. So hopefully we can get to your question. Yeah. So, big picture on the book, right? So what's the big overview of the book? I gotta make sure my mouse works. Okay, great. So we sort of take for granted, right, this idea that we can make fun of our leaders, that when Trump says that you should use Lysol to kill the coronavirus, that that's a good idea. And we can make fun of that, but right, so we sort of take that for granted. Now, have I frozen? Oh, I look like I'm frozen. Unfreeze. So we sort of take that for granted, that we can make fun of our presidents, right? And so this is a good thing for us, and it's sort of something that is sort of central to our idea of being an American. You got to get your own Lysol, Dr. Pancratz. You got to get your own Lysol. So we have used humor sort of throughout our country's history, even before we were really officially a country, where we liked making fun of Mad King George. And of course, right, Benjamin Franklin, one of our great founding fathers, is our sort of satiric founding father. And so we have a long history of making fun of our leaders. So this is not something that is new to us. And at the real core of American comedy is what's referred to as the Great American Joke. And this is the incongruity between the language of the Declaration of Independence and the reality of American life. So this idea that all men are created equal, obviously not then playing out in America. My son Hank is right behind me, so in case he flashes through, that's what it is. And so we see, there he is, we see this sort of tension play out essentially between people who think that there is an incongruity there, that we haven't lived up to that ideal of all men are created equal, juxtaposed against the people who think we have lived up to that idea. You know, right now we would call those people libertarians. Libertarian joke number one, they're coming. And so we see this play out over centuries, that the people who think we need progress towards that goal, and the people who think that we're already there. I think we know where that line lays. In terms of sort of satire specifically about the presidency, we've seen sort of over the last 60 years, and I sort of picked JFK as the starting point because in terms of the book is about sketch comedy, and we really sort of get our jumping off point there with Second City coming up in 1959, and sort of television kind of taking over there, and then what we'll talk about for a few minutes here, Von Meter's comedy album, The First Family, and sort of this sort of nationalization of performative satire about the president. So we have seen a pretty big shift here from JFK to today. And what the shift really boils down to is we've gone from essentially taking reality and exaggerating the absurd out of it. So we put JFK into what are normal situations. Right? So the first family is a look at a sort of typical day in the Kennedy White House, and we sort of pull out the absurdities there in order to sort of speak some truths about the man. But now we live in a time where reality is just absurd. You know, so the president going at a press conference yesterday and saying that we can shoot sunlight into our bodies and that will kill the virus, and that we should all have Lysol injected into us and that'll kill the virus. How do you make that more absurd? So what has happened is we've sort of switched then, and we look to sort of point out the sort of truth and moments of reality within that absurdity, which is why you see so much verbatim satire now, which kind of started with Tina Fey, where we just essentially see satirists repeating what the politician said. Right, McSweeney's posts Trump speeches just verbatim, right? So his Black History Month comments, they just posted those verbatim as a piece of satire. So that's kind of where we're at now, in this idea that satire is really working essentially to galvanize the base. Right? We see Samantha Bee kind of channeling everybody's outrage. John Oliver's working to sort of combat disinformation. Trevor Noah is working to sort of just be like, hey, isn't all of this insane? And isn't the system we live within insane? And we're kind of going from there. Historically speaking, when we're looking at the presidents in the book, we're really looking at their satiric treatment kind of boils down to how Americans think that they are, how they think that the president is reflecting our views, right? So when we see the president and we like the reflection, we like what that president is sort of saying about us, projecting about us, the satire tends to be more celebratory. It tends to be more sort of buoying the president. We see this. We'll see this with JFK. We'll see this with Ronald Reagan. We'll see this with Barack Obama. We see this sort of initially with Jimmy Carter, and then he sort of transitions out of that. Whereas on the flip side, when we have a president that maybe we don't like the reflection of American values, or sort of what their conception of who is included in We the People, we tend to see a little bit nastier, more negative satire taking place. You know, we see that today with Donald Trump, and of course we saw that with Nixon. We see that a little bit with LBJ. We see that at the end of Carter's presidency, and we sort of see all of it with Bill Clinton. He kind of crosses the gamut. So let's talk about JFK for a little bit, since that's who he voted to hear about. And we see some people are posting about their memories of the first family, which was all the craze, and we'll talk more about it. Can't wait. If you have a copy, it's probably worth a lot of money now because everybody got rid of him, and it was sort of taboo to have it after the assassination. And of course, von Meter's career essentially ended that day in November. My wife says, why isn't your mother commented on how smart you are yet? Well, it's because she doesn't know how to use Facebook. So we're looking at JFK. So like I said, a lot of the satire about JFK was really celebratory about him and his sort of vision of the future of America. And this sort of comes out of the sort of conformity culture of the 1950s. And we sort of see Kennedy coming in here as a literal new generation, right? He's gonna lead us in our new frontiers, and he is kind of representing then this new hope for what America could be. And it's less a sort of reaction to Eisenhower, and it's more just sort of a reaction to this idea of sort of normalcy. And we kind of forget that the 1950s is sort of the breeding ground for a lot of what happens in the 1960s, right? So the civil rights movement gets started in the 1950s. And a lot of the satire and comedy that we're talking about gets started here in the 1950s, right? So the Compass Players starts in the mid-1950s, which is the first improvised theater in the world, right? And you talk about a society where we're saying everything needs to be structured and normal, and right, we all live in our suburban row homes, and now here comes a form of theater where there's no script and you say whatever you want. I mean, that's sort of incredibly revolutionary, right? Mad Magazine starts up in the 50s as a sort of reaction to the McCarthy hearings. Jules Feiffer, a very famous editorial cartoonist who doesn't necessarily draw cartoons, sort of comes out there. And then, of course, The Second City comes out at the end of the 50s. So all of this is kind of, and we have Mort Saul on stand-up comedy, and Lenny Bruce and Dick Gregory are all sort of getting their starts here. So this idea that JFK is sort of representing is kind of something that a lot of comedians and satirists have already been talking about. So they're very much celebrating him. And most of the humor, we make fun a little bit of his money and his accent, of course, but what really ends up sort of the target of the satire are people who are opposed to JFK, right? So here at home, we see that pointed at Nixon. We see that pointed at Barry Goldwater. And of course, the main targets of JFK satire are Nikita Khrushchev and then Fidel Castro. But really, Khrushchev sort of becomes his main adversary. Because, right, essentially satirists are supporting JFK here, right, and using humor as a way to sort of assert our Americanness. Another important thing to note about JFK and some other presidents that are looked at in here is that he was very funny. And we sort of when we're looking at sort of history of satire, funny presidents get satirized less. Because they're good, right? So we see this with Obama. He was funnier than a lot of comedians were. So, how do you make fun of the guy who's funnier than you are? Of course, we see this with, Lincoln was very sort of famously very witty. Theodore Roosevelt was always good with a good quip. FDR was probably sort of the first president who really made sort of humor a part of his presidency, essentially. And he essentially sort of links himself with Will Rogers, who was, I guess, sort of the Jon Stewart of his time, but only much, much, much more famous and much, much, much more influential. And they would oftentimes sort of broadcast back to back on the radio. So we'd hear Will Rogers and then we'd hear FDR, and they sort of had this relationship with each other that sort of buoyed one another. They didn't, always agree on things, but we sort of see that building there. So, right, we see, Reagan was sort of very famously funny with one-liners. He was, every press conference he ever held, he told Soviet jokes. And so those presidents tend to get satirized a little bit lighter. They get a little bit lighter treatment. As opposed to our presidents who maybe weren't so funny or didn't think humor had a place, they tend to get treated a little more harshly. I could think of one example right off the top of my head of a president who doesn't think humor exists. Another thing about JFK before we get into the little excerpt here is, it sounds stupid now, but he was one of the very first presidents that we actually sort of heard and saw all the time. We didn't hear our president before that often. FDR was sort of the first who made a big deal of it. Teddy Roosevelt was the first one to really sort of make use of film and images. But we didn't see them as often as we do now, right? So, now we sort of see Trump is sort of ever present in our lives. Obama was too. And we sort of just take that as par for the course, right? But when, JFK really sort of harnessed the power of TV in a way that we hadn't necessarily seen. And what that does is it allows a different kind of satire to emerge. And of course, right, technology and humor always have a big a big influence on what we're doing and how we see things. So, right, Von Meter, his impression of JFK worked in part because Americans were used to seeing JFK on TV. His being JFK's own ease then on TV also made it easier for Von Meter, right? Because Kennedy was so good on television, it made it easier to sort of make fun of him on TV. Okay, so I'm going to read a little excerpt here. It's going to be amazing, and then we'll do a little Q&A. So that was a little background for you. All right, so we're picking up in the John F. Kennedy chapter, which is, I don't know, I think it's chapter 2. White soda. Not a sponsor, it could be. So it's not an accident that Second City and Von Meter's most popular Kennedy sketches were the mock press conference. Kennedy's media savvy was part of his appeal. He was so good during these press conferences that it was only natural that comic impressions of him at a press conference would be too, and that they would feed the idea that the real Kennedy was good at them, creating a sort of feedback loop. Because audiences could see and hear the real Kennedy like no president before, they could see and hear Meter like no satirist before, the audience was able to be in on the joke in a way that no previous audience really could be before. Kennedy, being quick on his feet, turned out to be a boon to comics versed in improvisation. The quicker-witted Meter and the Second City actors perfectly summed up and were set up for the moment. The symbiotic relationship between the president and his impersonators worked to further the careers of both Meter and Kennedy. The more Meter and the Second City actors seemed like Kennedy, the more the audience laughed. The more the audience laughed, the more they liked JFK. Meter's quick wit in the press conferences matches Kennedy's own wit, giving Meter's impression a sense of authenticity that other JFK impressions lacked. The two men became synonymous with one another, something that initially boosted Meter's career, rocketing him from complete obscurity to America's favorite comic. But that linking would ultimately end when Americans couldn't disassociate Meter from Kennedy, sending Meter to obscurity nearly as quickly as it hurtled him to stardom. While Meter was perfecting his JFK, a couple of unknown comedy writers and a disc jockey began to write a radio script about JFK and his family. They just needed a leading man, so they went on a scouting mission to see Mr. Meter after they had seen him impersonate JFK on Celebrity Talent Scouts, which was like a Star Search or American Idol of the time. And there's actually a very famous letter from Von Meter to JFK saying, "Mr. President, I just wanted to let you know I did an impression of you on TV. I hope that's okay. Please don't take any offense," if you can imagine that happening now. One of the writers remarked that Meter was, quote, "a kind of a country hick from Maine, just another barrel house piano player, but his voice was very New England. He barely imitated Kennedy because he was that voice." They hired Meter pretty much immediately and set about making their album, which is a series of short sketches parodying life in the Kennedy White House. The problem was no label wanted it because they feared no radio station would play it. Impersonating the president simply was not done. ABC, Paramount Records president and former Eisenhower press secretary James Haggerty said the idea of the first family was, quote, "degrading to the presidency, and every communist country in the world would love this record." All of the major labels turned them down until Tiny Cadence Records gave them the green light. They recorded the album on October 22nd, 1962, and for the historians out there, you know what happened that night. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis speech. They recorded it in front of a live studio audience. The team immediately knew that they were onto something. The blistering laughter almost becomes another character on the record. Initially, the Cadence Records president, Archie Blyer, was furious with the laughter and said that they could never release the album and they had to record over it because there was too much laughter and you couldn't hear the lines. So they did record it again. The next week, the audience was silent, so they released the original recording instead. Even though nobody wanted to produce it, the first family turned out to be a massive hit. It became the fastest selling record of all time to date. Not just the fastest selling comedy record, the fastest selling record, period. It sold over 7.5 million copies and won the 1963 Grammy for Album of the Year. Billboard said, quote, "There has never been an album that has broken so many records or set so many new ones." Music stores in New York had to extend their hours to accommodate demand, while 8 new pressing plants had to be opened and hired to help keep up with printing demands. The First Family wasn't the first comedy album. Lenny Bruce, Shelley Berman, Jonathan Winters, Bob Newhart, Nichols and May had all released successful albums. It wasn't even the first presidential impression on the radio. Dean Murphy, Will Rogers, and others had impersonated FDR in the 30s. Rogers had actually earlier impersonated Calvin Coolidge in a Dodge car ad in 1928, for which Rogers was forced to apologize. Yet somehow, The First Family, a sketch comedy album by an unknown comedian featuring an unknown voice talent released on a small, unknown independent label, surpassed them all. Meter suddenly found himself making regular appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. He was overnight America's brightest and biggest comedy star. The First Family also proved that making jokes about the president was a lucrative business, one that would continue to grow exponentially over the last half century. Oh no, I lost my place. How did this happen? It's my book. A string of imitation albums would follow very quickly, most of which were hoping to ride on the coattails of The First Family or confuse people into buying the wrong record. This is something like my mom would have done. Like The Family at the White House. Other albums tried to take on other First Families, like The Other Family about Khrushchev or The Last Family about Castro. And Imagine Black President was at the center of The Funniest Dream on record. There was even an album that was a sing-along with JFK. Now, obviously, Kennedy's Cuban Missile Crisis speech has gotten more attention, but October 22nd, 1962 also marks a seminal moment in contemporary sketch comedy about the presidency. Suddenly, something that was just not done was being done all the time. As the following chapters unfold, we'll see the evolution from just not done to everybody's doing it to no need to satirize Trump. He literally just said you could spray Lysol down your throat to combat the coronavirus. While satire about the presidency is everywhere in contemporary America, including coming out of the mouth and Twitter feed of our president, it was virtually nowhere on a national scale in 1962. The turning point for it all was The First Family. The record's success and future satirical depictions of the presidency also hinged on Kennedy's reaction to the record. Now, the Kennedy administration, like a lot of Americans, they first heard the album on the radio. It was designed to be played on the radio, so it had short sketches that could be played in between commercial breaks, and it enjoyed ample radio play. According to Nicholas Cole, presidential advisor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. was driving to work, and he thought he was listening to a routine Kennedy press conference. A reporter asks, "Now that you're in office, what do you think the chances are of a Jewish president?" And in Kennedy's signature voice, Schlesinger thought he heard the president say, "Well, I think they're pretty good. Let me say, I don't see why a person of the Jewish faith can't be president of the United States. I know that as a Catholic, I could never vote for him, but other than that." Reportedly, Schlesinger almost drove off the road. You're also welcome for that amazing impersonation. When he got to the White House, he sounded the alarms warning of a possible Orson Welles' War of the Worlds type of panic. Now, some people say that his response was much more measured than that, and he wasn't all that worried about it. But he did write a memo that would impact all future presidents. He wrote, quote, "This raises the question of what in the hell a president of the United States ought to do about mimicry." The Los Angeles Times wrote an article where a lot of people were confused about what was happening. Quote, "Many people started to write the White House asking, what in the world is the president doing talking that way right on the air for everyone to hear?" A story in the New York Times recounted an exchange with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who is JFK's brother. So, if you're complaining about nepotism now. He was making a phone call and he reportedly said, yes, I tell you, I am the Attorney General. After a pause, he said, "Very well," and hung up. Kennedy then said, "That guy thinks I'm Vaughn Meter. He's going to call me back just to make sure." Publicly, Kennedy used the impression to help boost his popularity, but privately, many people close to him said he disliked it, and his administration set about contacting the FCC to try and ban broadcasts of the album, or at the very least to preface any of the sketches with a disclaimer that it was not actually Kennedy. His team, they talked about a lot of different things. One of the things they talked about was sort of fake news, hiring a magazine to write a negative review of the album and blast it and say this sort of thing shouldn't be happening. But none of that came to fruition because Americans loved the record. And Kennedy was too good at media to let it sort of slip by. So rather than try and stop it, the team quickly pivoted and they tried to control the message. In short, they wanted to use the record rather than let it use them. He was the subject of the most popular album of the day, and he was smart enough to capitalize on that. A decade later, we would see Gerald Ford do the opposite of this when he took a very hands-off approach to Saturday Night Live. His press secretary, Ron Nessen, actually hosted the show, and Ford made an appearance himself, and they were sort of historically were like, just let them do whatever they want, which essentially then the show eviscerated the two of them. And then, of course, we all know how combative Trump has been with the show. Kennedy, on the other hand, played along and sort of took the lead. Whatever he thought privately or did behind the scenes, publicly, he played along. He used his own charm and wit to diffuse any negative impact from the record, and he used it to enhance his appeal. He reportedly bought 100 copies of the record to give out as Christmas gifts to people. At a December 1962 press conference, he was asked about the explosion of satire aimed at the White House, and I posted this clip on the page if you want to look at it, on, quote, whether they produced annoyment or enjoyment. And Kennedy laughed, and he says, annoyment? No. He goes, yes, I have read them and listened to them, and actually I listened to Meter's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me. Can you imagine Trump making that kind of joke now, right? Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't do the voice this time. I let you all down. We'll just stop now. He reportedly played the record before a cabinet meeting, when this echoes a long sort of history of Lincoln would read sort of comic bits before cabinet meetings. Theodore Roosevelt would do the same thing. And he went to a dinner with the Democratic National Committee, and he started by saying, I'll do the accent this time, Vaughn Mita was busy tonight, so I came myself. You're welcome. Kennedy's embrace of humor may have created the wave of Kennedy-related humor. Thomas Last argued in the New York Times that Kennedy's wit encouraged comedians to satirize the president because he was sharp and witty enough to appreciate what they were doing and big enough to laugh at himself. In the end, it was immaterial if Kennedy liked the record or not. He was making the most of it. Now, for those of you that have listened to the record, and I posted a link to YouTube, so you can listen to it if you haven't, it's a love letter to Kennedy. It's a love letter to the promise of his administration. It's a love letter to the excitement that the Kennedys had brought to Washington, to the family. And the liner notes to it are sort of preposterously naive. So I'll read them to you now. So it says, this album is for fun. Things are being suggested and said here about some of the great people of our time, and perhaps the very fact that they are able to laugh with us and enjoy this album is in part what makes them the great people that they are. No one has more respect for the high offices and the people suggested here than those of us who had a hand in putting this together. This album can be played loudly at any time, night or day, in front of anyone. Anywhere, people have a right to laugh. We hope that someday soon, everyone, everywhere, will have that right to laugh. Now, as innocent as that sounds, and it certainly is, the notes are a direct appeal to American values of freedom and liberty. Now, remember, I said that the JFK satire was meant to bolster him against his Cold War adversaries. Right? The album becomes a symbol of America's greatness, of Kennedy's superiority to Khrushchev. In America, ordinary citizens can make fun of the president without fear of retribution. In the Soviet Union, an album like that, like The First Family, would have gotten Meter killed or imprisoned. The album, therefore, is a direct appeal to the inherently democratic ideals at the heart of Americanness, the very ideals that were at stake in the Cold War. Laughing with the Kennedys was not a slap in the face to JFK, but a slap to the Soviet Union. Kennedy himself recognized the importance of publicly supporting the album and the right to criticize him. It's perhaps a bit hyperbolic, but the album did signify, as satire has throughout America's history, the freedom of speech that's so central to our concept of what it means to be an American. Now, some presidents have defended this right, like Lincoln and TR or FDR. LBJ sort of did. While others, fill in the blank, find such criticism to be anti-American. So much of the JFK satire celebrates not just JFK, but the American values satirizing him represented. Part of winning the Cold War was asserting and protecting the constitutional right to laugh at our president. So I'll stop there for the reading, yes. And as Dr. Pankratz says, right, it certainly was a generational sort of breath of fresh air, right, to have the young, beautiful family in there after grandfather Eisenhower. So let's move to the raffle, and then we'll do some Q&A, huh? This will be exciting. So remember, if you shared the event, you were entered into a poll for my mom to buy you a copy of the book. Now, I should warn you that she is more than likely not going to send you a copy of the book. You probably get like a microwave or something in like 9 years. But we'll do it anyway. So thank you to everyone who did send, who did share the event, and who showed up here. Yes, this event, I guess, is sponsored by my mother. Not a sponsor, could be. So here we go, drum roll. So we're doing a little simulator. Here we go. And Janine Busak, you win a copy of the book valued at over $7,000. So yeah, so we'll get in contact with you, and my mom will send you a microwave in 9 years, maybe a copy of the book. So let's do a little Q&A. If you're around, you have some time, if you have questions. They don't have to be about Kennedy. They can be about sort of presidential satire in general. So we have questions. We have questions, comments. I think I'm a little ahead of you all, so I'll wait here. Here we go. My seltzer. We have any questions? More voices? No, you have to ask questions. That's not. So we have someone who goes to American University. Would you like a signed copy from Matt's mom? Yes, my mom should sign the copy. That would be amazing. We could give away a lot of those. Somebody is behind the kitchen door. Do we have any questions? We have any questions? The turnips are not for sale on our island today. Our Nook's Cranny is being upgraded. So we can't. So Vicky Kuhn says, what's your favorite president impersonation? So we did a poll. You all voted. Who did you end up picking? It was close. So let's see who you guys picked, and then I'll tell you who I picked. So you all voted for Will Ferrell's George W. Bush as the most. Donald Trump was very close second. I think my favorite is probably Dana Carvey's George H.W. Bush, because it sort of mixes all of the different ideas of satire that we sort of see within it, of personality, of just sort of exaggeration, of creating a whole nother character. My favorite individual sketch has got to be hands down Phil Hartman's McDonald's sketch as Bill Clinton. It's just an amazing sketch where he goes to he just goes back and forth through all the things that Clinton has there. And it's just an amazing sort of depiction, especially when you look at what ends up happening to Clinton, and it's all sort of in there in that sketch. But there aren't really any bad ones other than Will Forte's W. I'm just kidding. Okay, wait, I missed some questions. They're all coming too fast now. Let's see. Scroll. Other ones. Okay. So, it's time for questions. It is, yeah, so we got to turn-ups. What's the most influential SNL skit? Well, they're called sketches, Dr. Ryle. The most influential has to be Chevy Chase's Gerald Ford. because none of this would have happened without it. So probably those first Ford sketches where Chase is taking on the president, and he does it in a way that we really haven't ever seen since, and he makes no attempt to mimic him. He just, the catchphrase becomes, I'm Chevy Chase and you're not, and that sort of applies to all of those. So without those, none of them happen. You could make an argument that SNL sort of dies out after it. So that sketch is the most important, and then Eddie Murphy's the most important cast member, because without him, SNL is dead in the 80s, and it was on the brink of being canceled. So he kind of saved us all. Alex says, so do you think it's aware to be... So Alex Hermans, wait, is it time for questions? Yes. If so, how important do you think it is to be aware of our history when it comes to observing the present day of comedy? Well, I think history is important to anything, and I think that's one of the hardest parts of sketch comedy and political sketch comedy is you have to be versed in so many things. So you have to know the history of what's happening. You have to know the sort of complexities of a particular issue. You have to know what sort of all the components of it are. What are all the people saying about it? And then you have to convey it to us in something that's funny and short. So yes, and I think if you look historically, the first chapter of the book kind of tracks American satire historically with the presidency, and you could see some sort of very through lines there of sort of how we've made fun of our presidents and what it means and what it says about us at particular times. There's so many sort of striking similarities just in sort of the way that certain presidents use or don't use humor. So, Lincoln to Roosevelt to JFK to Obama, not talking about their policies, but like just the way they all used humor to further their policies, is an interesting thing. Okay, so if I had, Eric says, if you had to write a buddy cop movie using two of the presidents, who would you use and why? Let's see. Well, Bill Clinton has to be in it. It's probably George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton would be the sort of obvious one, right? So, George H.W. Bush is the straight-laced career politician, and he's the detective leading it, and Bill Clinton is the one always getting into trouble. And so the two of them are trying to find the deep state, and it turns out it doesn't exist because you're a radical right-wing nutjob. So that's the pitch. So Kokol says, the Kennedy spoof was very loving. Would Kennedy have gotten behind them if they had ridiculed him? That's a great question. Probably not, right? But I don't think the public would have gotten behind it either, because he was too beloved and we were not as cynical as we have become, in part because of the Kennedy assassination. But I don't think that a ridiculing in the way that we sort of just hammer Donald Trump, that would have flown in the 60s. If we look back, right, Nixon gets treated pretty harshly. LBJ's policies in Vietnam get treated pretty harshly, but not so much him as sort of an individual. We see Clinton almost, his scandals are almost celebrated. We really, we get a little bit of sort of harsher treatment with him as his presidency progresses. But really, Trump's the first president who gets sort of really viciously attacked. We see it with Nixon earlier, but I just don't think that we would have been mean to Kennedy in that way. I don't think it would have flown with people. And knowing his media savvy, the Kennedys probably would have had Meter killed if he was mean to them. They're the Kennedys. Let's see, Melissa McCarthy, Sean Spicer. Yeah, so right, if there were to be another poll, it would be sort of the best non-presidential SNL political impersonations. And if there's anybody out there, any young budding scholars, right, a great paper would be sort of Kate McKinnon's turn as essentially everybody in the Trump White House. And what does it sort of mean that she plays all these other people? Let's see. Do we talk about record to TV to class? So there's a little bit in there about sort of technology and how that affects our sort of views of and how we process and make satire based on sort of the medium of the day. And we see that sort of play out today here in just that we're playing to very specific audiences. One of the things that we always sort of chide SNL about is that they're too broad, blah, 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 but they're, of course, playing to a mass audience that somebody who is, doing stuff on YouTube to a very select amount of people don't have to. But, one of the big sort of transitions would be TV in that we can see the person, so there's a big worry in the sort of early half of the 20th century that a vocal impression would be a national security risk. So that's why when Will Rogers impersonated Calvin Coolidge on the radio, for a commercial for Dodge, it caused sort of big uproar, right? And he had to make a very public apology about it. So there is some in there about media and changing technologies. I'm sure someone else could write something a little deeper in that. Sean Spicer, not a president, could be. Please no. No, please don't vote for Sean Spicer. So sketch versus a skit. A skit is something Cub Scouts do. It's what sort of Mick Napier's definition has been. A skit is something that we just sort of throw together. It's kind of fun. It's like, Greek week for all the college people. A sketch is something that has a little bit more craft and art and skill to it. And we're sort of trying to make a point about it as opposed to like, I'm playing air guitar. As we go there, we need that young lady's address. Okay, yeah, we'll get it. Mom says show the book. They haven't sent me the book yet. We're in the middle of a global pandemic. Yeah. The scene where there's a prime. Okay, no. There's okay. Yeah, everybody threw up. Yeah. Bush threw up in Japan. Okay, people are watching. Jeff Sessions is creepy. Bloody Andrew Jackson. I don't have the book, Mike. The book doesn't. I don't have it. Okay. If I miss questions, are there more questions coming? I can't believe nobody's asking about Trump. This is great. Talk about Trump or the current state of satire. I could sign your book, but I think you probably would prefer my mother to sign the book for you, Heather. Hey, Linda, thanks for watching. Hi. How long did it take to write the book? So I've had the idea for a while. I teach a class at Albright that's called Sketch, Satire in the State. It's about more than sketch, but it's sort of where it started. No, Devin, there is a book. I just don't have it yet. And of course, anybody who's took that, there's Hank again. The best thing that ever happened in that class is that one day that girl just got up and left to go get a hoagie from Wawa. But so that's sort of where the idea came for. Writing the book took about 1.5 years, just sort of going through all of the various presidents and sort of digging into each of them. And then sort of going back and being, synergizing everything together. So it's about 18 months or so in writing it. Yes, no, there is a book, everybody. You guys suck. You can order the book right now if you do it through the publisher, which is Routledge. I don't know where the link is to it. It's on sale there. You could also get it through Amazon. It's not on sale there. Let me see if I can find the link for it. I'll post it for you. 20% off books, 35% off ebooks. That's amazing. Hank, you have a question?
Do you know how to sell books?
Do I know how to sell books? Well, I just let other people sell them. Okay, so here we go. I'm putting the link to, that's where you could get it through the publisher. So there you go. How is satire used in other countries against? Yeah, that's a good question. So the focus of this book's more on our presidents, but it certainly is. I think one of the things that sort of stands out is how much more negative we are and how much safer we feel in that negativity. Most other places around the world, right? I mean, there's sort of stories all the time about satirists being imprisoned in other countries for saying things that are much less negative than what is happening now. And we hear Trump talk about that in sort of loving terms. One of the sort of master strokes of his political life would be conflating NBC News and Saturday Night Live into one category, and it's sort of all negative media attention. So he's been pretty effectively doing that. Do other nations still have reverence for their leaders? Well, yeah, I mean, yes and no. It depends where you are. Do we revere our leaders? I don't know. You don't have to look all that far back to when satire about Barack Obama, the first couple of years of his presidency was, he was literally depicted as a superhero. Not so much on SNL because they had no black people to play the president, but a lot of the other depictions that we have of him, he's literally there. He's literally a superhero savior. And so, I mean, that's sort of probably as reverent as you can get. NBC in the early 80s was Lorne Michaels was gone at that time. So they essentially, a lot of the people on the show at that time talked about how there was a lot of corporate edicts to go easy on Reagan, to not say a lot about Reagan, as sort of to protect our national psyche. Because we wanted to be done with the sort of tumult of the 60s and 70s and move on. So there's a lot of sort of interesting tidbits like that. And that didn't answer your question at all. Any other comments, questions? Who are we watching? Do people watch anything now? No. I'll give you another second, one more sip of water, see if there are any more questions. So I guess I'll wrap up with just a little quick sort of recap of where satire is at now then. So we sort of, we started with JFK here and the sort of celebratory satire of, USA, USA. As you go through the book, you'll see that sometimes that happens and sometimes it's the president is the one stopping us from achieving our USA chance. And so we get a little nastier. Okay, yes. So Trump has not killed satire, but we see, we get a lot of people saying he's been great for it. He's been great for it. He's been terrible for it. Because he's as a character, he's not very funny. He's not very dimensional, right? I mean, he sort of is who he is. He's been on the national scene for decades. And the stuff he says, you just can't make that funnier. So, how do you more obviously illustrate someone who doesn't understand science than having that person say you should spray Lysol down your throat? So that's why we see now a lot of just outrage or satirists sort of advocating for action. To me, almost what's more interesting is what happens next. So when if Trump leaves the White House, how do we satirically treat the next president? Because we've sort of gotten to this level where everything is at sort of 100 degrees all the time, right? Everything is outrage. Everything is, I can't believe this is happening. So can we ever go back to Dana Carvey saying no new taxes, right? I'm not going to raise taxes. So I think that will be an interesting turn. Rachel says, as new voices and groups of Americans are brought to light and harsher criticism of older politics continue to roll out, how do you think that will reflect on the oh no, that went away. Yeah, that's a great question. So we see that a lot. One of the things in the JFK chapter and other chapters is essentially, right, satirists in the media just pretend like all of the personal things he was doing didn't exist. We think about, right, Bill Clinton and the way he's treated, that his sort of sexual proclivities are almost celebrated in those sketches. And you sort of watch them now and they're a little cringeworthy. If you look at just the trajectory of Hillary Clinton satire, you can tell when SNL hires women and when they don't, right? So she goes from sort of a feminazi to not necessarily a likable character, but someone with a little more dimension when they magically hire women. So, one of the through lines, and obviously we see this with Obama, and, SNL has no idea how to deal with him because they're all white. Which is why Key and Peele's stuff is so much better, because, right, that sort of the cool sketch that Fred Armisen does, right, where I'm Obama, I keep it cool, and they leave out the most important part of it, which is, why does he have to keep it cool? And that's at the heart of Key and Peele's, right, Luther the Anger Translator, is that he's being held to this impossible standard of, if he's a black man and gets angry, right, he's a crazy angry black man, and if as a black man he doesn't get angry about things, well, then that just proves that racism doesn't exist, right, and that's just completely missing from SNL. So we see that historically, this sort of idea of the satirist as, me, middle-aged white male, and all the things that we sort of miss from that. Kukol asks about Obama's roast of Trump. Well, yes, so the White House Correspondents' Dinner, if you're unfamiliar with it, right, Obama and Seth Meyers both sort of go after Trump. I forget the date, it's like 2012, 2013. And, sort of make fun of him, like, oh, he must be really stewing over these very important decisions, like who should he fire over the Omaha Steaks debacle. Reportedly, right, that then became sort of the impetus for Trump wanting to run for re-election, not re-election, but run for the presidency. I think that's a little overblown, right? He had been running for president since 2000. And, to be 100% honest, a lot of this is about race. He's a birther. We forget that, right? He's a birther. His whole movement starts in birtherism, which is just sort of the most racist thing you can kind of think of. Certainly Trump's thin skin plays into it, and I think that partly, that roast probably partly plays into why he wants to undo so much of Obama. Let's see, how should I teach about this time in history for future classes? Not a sponsor, could be. That's Nixie football, everybody's favorite teacher now. That's a great question. I have no idea. It's hard to contextualize how sort of far from normal, I guess, we've come. Where you're sort of thinking of this sort of hyper partisanship, where we're in this sort of era where the president can contradict science during his press conferences, and everybody's like, yeah, that's just our president. So I don't know. Maybe John Pancratz can answer that question for you better than I can. It's going to be, it's hard to explain right now what's happening. So how do you explain it to future classes? I'm not sure. In terms of sort of media fracturing, a lot of it starts with the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 by the Reagan administration, where essentially it gets rid of the idea that punditry, I can sort of express my opinions and pretend like they're news. And so this essentially allows the Fox News to exist. And so that kind of starts this sort of shift to absurd reality. So Devin says, what can we do to satirize Trump when his base still sees him as strong and smart? Well, so right when we're looking at satire, we're looking at that satiric triangle. So it has satirist, audience, and target. And right now, we've sort of moved into a spot, and it's sort of illuminated by Stephen Colbert's Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Report, that if the target doesn't realize they're the target or doesn't care that they're the target, does the satire matter? And that's really where we've seen satire shift then to playing to its base. So we see a lot less trying to convince people, oh, hey, Trump, doesn't know what he's talking about, or, whatever issue you want, and more, let's all sort of, you're not alone, right? We see a lot more of that kind of satire. Those Jordan Klepper Daily Show bits in 2016 are really painful to watch now, as this sort of like liberals sort of laughing at Trump supporters. Be like, how do they not see their cognitive dissonance? Right, and then they don't care about it, and they don't care what the Daily Show has to say for them. And part of the reason they love Trump is because he takes them on and calls them fake. Right, and that's part of what they really love about him, and it was a thing that we sort of missed in 2016. Everybody was like, "Oh my God, he called Mexican rapists! How could he? That's disqualifying." When it was his sort of very charged language attacking these sort of establishments that was really resonating with his base. So when we see those satiric things, sort of, that guy who's wearing the "Trump that bitch" T-shirt. Talking about Hillary Clinton, and then he's talking about how, right, as Americans, we really respect women. As someone on the outside, you see that, right? How does he have that? How does he make that work in his head? But to the people at that rally, they don't give a shit about Jordan Klepper. And so that's why we've seen so much of the satire move away from trying to convince people. That's why just Samantha Bee is just mad all the time. And John Oliver is not trying to convince, radical right-wingers that the FCC net neutrality is bad. Or that, you know what I mean. Right, he's talking to people who believe what he believes, and the sort of big change would be that they're now asking you explicitly, go do something, right? Go do something about it. So historically, we see satire was a sort of implicit call to action. We see it explicitly a few times in history, right, with Ben Franklin and during Vietnam. But we hadn't really seen that for a generation. And now we're sort of seeing it again. Go do this thing, go do X, go do Y. This is how you can sort of resist. And so where satire goes after that is a tricky spot. So how do you sort of step down? What happened the last time after, sort of the outrages during Vietnam was, SNL sort of blew up on the scene. They're like, hey, we're not taking anybody's garbage. We're a new generation. And then NBC was like, okay, once that cast is gone, tamp it down. We're done with that now. So yeah. There are other questions. Have I missed questions? Matt Ortiz is waving. Hi, Matt. Yeah, the muscular Trump memes. So there we go. Okay, so we're roughly at 2 o'clock, I think. Yeah, or 1 o'clock in the Central Time. So I think, unless there are any other questions, I think hopefully I hit all the questions. Thanks for coming. I appreciate it a lot. This was fun. Hope didn't ramble on too much. Or now you're all very offended and you're going to write very angrily worded letters to me. Yeah, so Janine, congratulations. My mom's going to send you a microwave at some point. And yeah, so thanks for tuning in, spending an hour with me. I appreciate it. And yay, USA. Okay. There's Hank, everybody.